We have a digital version of this. So if you miss something, you can go back and watch it later. My name is Joseph Lennon. I'm the Emily C. Riley Director of the Center for Irish Studies. And I just want to give a couple of announcements about things that are upcoming, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Craig Bailey, who will introduce our speaker, or introduce John. First off, Hidetaka Hirota's talk on immigration and Irish-American immigration as a model for later immigration and immigration policy. Unfortunately, because of the campus shutting down during that bomb scare, we had to reschedule, and that will be coming up in April. So Dr. Hirota will be coming back. Before then, we have our Heimbold chair, Kaveri Madhavan, who's up here in the front row, will be reading on February 24th over in the President's Lounge. So please join us there. There'll be a reception starting at 6, and then the reading at 7. Also, if you have not seen this postcard, please do not leave without one or two. We are bringing a play over from Dublin by Broken Talkers. It's called Bellow, and it is about, and featuring the Kerry accordion player Danny O'Mahony. And it's really about his life as an accordionist and as a traditional musician. And coming to a point in his life where he's begun to question, was it worth it? Was it all worth it? So it's a powerful play, and it'll be over in the Mullen Theater at March 11th to the 13th, so 3 shows. So please come, put it on your calendars. Tickets are now available, right? Yep. They're up, and so don't miss it. With no further ado, Craig Bailey.
Hi, my name is Craig Bailey. I am an associate professor in the Department of History. I'm sometimes graduate director, and I am affiliated with the Center for Irish Studies. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. John Borgonovo, who did his PhD at the University College Cork and is now a senior lecturer in the School of History at UCC. John has published extensively on different aspects of Ireland's First World War and revolutionary experiences, and his work often uses Cork City and County as a lens through which to view those topics. One of John's many publications was the critically acclaimed Atlas of the Irish Revolution, of which he was one of the editors, and which was made into a television series, a very well-received documentary on RTE. That documentary reflects John's role as an active public historian who frequently appears on Irish television and radio. Among his many teaching responsibilities at Cork, John serves as the coordinator of the MA in History and teaches a course on public history, which we also have here at Villanova, so it's going to be fascinating to hear about public history from the Irish perspective. And John's talk today on mapping revolutionary Ireland is going to look at the Atlas of the Irish Revolutionary Project. And John's going to speak for 40, 45 minutes?
45 probably, yeah.
Good, 50. And there's going to be time for Q&A at the end. And so now I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to ask you to please help me welcome John.
Thank you. Thanks, and it's a thrill to be here. I've never been to Villanova before. I was saying that I was a big fan of Villanova in '85 when they won their first title. So I remember that Ed Pickney team very well. So I wanted to give you an oversight of this, an overview of this project I was involved with, the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, which has kind of continued. It started about 2014, 2015, and we only kind of wound down last year. And we've had a number of iterations, and it's the idea of kind of creating visual entranceways to make kind of scholastic history more accessible to a broader audience. And so I'll explain a bit of that. But I'll explain some of the methodologies we used and some of the narratives we tried to structure. So we're just coming out, and over in Ireland, we're just coming out of what we call the decade of centenaries. And so that was this, it was actually 11 years, was the long decade. It was a whole series of events designed to mark the anniversaries of major episodes that involve the creation of modern Ireland and the modern Irish state. So like the First World War, the 1916 Easter Rising, the conscription crisis, the campaign for women's suffrage, partition of Northern Ireland, the Irish War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and the Irish Civil War, amongst other things. And we had very intense public engagement with all these topics. And part of that was also because there had been kind of this shadow over modern Irish history, particularly this history, that emanated from the Northern Ireland Troubles. And, you know, when you, there was a tendency to, traditional scholarship had often celebrated the campaign for independence, the violent campaign for independence, and that celebration became more problematic when a paramilitary kind of civil war was raging in Northern Ireland. And so a lot of Irish scholars stepped back. What you might call the Irish establishment wasn't very happy engaging deeply with these topics they were seen as politically sensitive and probably problematic. But that begins to change with the end of the Northern Ireland Troubles, and really the emergence of a stable peace process. And really by 2004, 2005, 2006, Anglo-Irish relations really get normalized, and they're healthiest they've been in 100 years. And Queen Elizabeth comes over in 2011, is kind of given a warm welcome. President Michael D. Higgins goes over to Britain for the first time on a state visit, and everything seems to be calmed down quite a bit. And that creates an easier foundation for us to engage with problematic and contested episodes from this history. And then we were also benefited from, again, all this, the end of the Troubles. Academics had anticipated that there'd be big public interest in these episodes and these anniversaries. So a lot of people were preparing new research. A lot of folks were preparing monographs. And the kind of new scholarship that we might call it post-revisionist, post-nationalist, it really brought in multi-disciplines. It was contextualizing events, looking, internationalizing some of the episodes. Gender, the involvement of women's kind of a major element of all this. And it moves beyond kind of a narrow focus on political violence. So all that's healthy for the scholarship. Now, we'll go over to my home university, University College Cork. And we had already started producing the Atlas series. I wasn't involved in either of these, there were about 3 or maybe 4 publications. And these were basically produced, they were led by the UCC Geography Department, and then they would invite in folks from the History Department as well. And they're also published by our Cork University Press, which is our academic publishing arm. And there are these big, if you haven't seen any of these books, they're really big, they're quite visual. They use photographs, they use paintings, they use documents, but the content is scholarship, strong scholarship, produced in a way that's accessible to a broader audience. So the intellectual foundations are there, but the presentation is more amenable to more general readers. And these were very successful books, particularly the Atlas of the Great Famine. That was a very successful book. That became a TV series narrated by Liam Neeson. I'll get to that, the TV stuff in a minute. Now, we also benefited from the release of new archival material. And part of the dynamic with the Decades of Centenaries was the Irish government was making available funds to carry out research, was giving a lot of funds to local archives and national archives. And we had some major digitization efforts undertaken. And also, they made funds available for academic conferences. Not now, in the grand scheme of things, is a drop in the bucket. But for those of us in academia who are starving, crawling in the desert, it was a flask of water when you're and we were able to utilize a lot of that to produce new scholarship and also new perspectives. I'll just point out two of the major collections. One was called the Military Service Pension Collection, which were the Irish government gave pensions to veterans of the Irish War of Independence and Irish Civil War. And they gave these in the 1930s, and they created a whole wave of documentation. And about 80,000 people, men and women, applied for pensions. And not all that material has been released yet, but they're under, like we just had another release a couple days ago. But thousands of these, tens of thousands of these files have already been released, and a lot of the supporting documentation. That stuff's great. That stuff played a factor in some of our maps we produced. We also had this Bureau of Military History, which was an oral history project conducted by the Irish government in the 1940s to interview veterans of the independence struggle, with the understanding that the most of the archival documentation was coming from British government sources, and that because of particularly the War of Independence was a guerrilla campaign, there was relatively little documentation that survived. So they had to go out and extract testimony and some documentation from folks who had survived this. I also want to say that one of the primary drivers of the Bureau project was a guy called Diarmuid Lynch. He was the senior-most leader of the 1916 Rising to survive. He's expelled from Ireland in 1917, and he sets up shop in Philadelphia. And he's close with McGarry, and he lives here till the 1930s, and then he goes back to Ireland. And he's a key person who convinces this project to get undertaken. He's a fascinating character. So we have all this going on. So we put together, UCC kind of we put together this idea of an atlas to look at revolutionary Ireland. We have a template from the previous atlas series. It's John Crowley from geography. Our cartographer is Mike Murphy, and to have a cartographer available to you is like, it's best case scenario. You're able to produce maps, you're able to think visually, you're able to create, just think about data sets. And rather than writing whole big academic articles, you're able just to, I'm just going to create a data set of this stuff that has a geographic kind of basis that might have a map. And so just that kind of frees you to undertake. It's like breaking into the open field if you're a running back, and all of a sudden you can just go any direction you want. And then we had, from my department, Donal O'Driscoll, who's done a lot of work particularly around labor history and cultural history, and then I kind of got brought in a little bit later on. So the part of what we were trying to do was we all of us kind of agreed that we didn't really like the great man theory of history, that we didn't want to focus on elites, and let me take a step back, just to give you a nomenclature. We're talking about the independence movement. There's a small independence movement prior to 1916. It starts growing during the First World War and the stresses the country's under. There's an insurrection in 1916, the Easter Rising, and then out of the ashes of that, a mass movement develops, new political party called Sinn Féin, a paramilitary wing called the Irish Volunteers, later known as the Irish Republican Army, a women's wing, the Cumann Amon, which is both paramilitary and political, and then also there's labor uses as well. So all this stuff comes together. There's a guerrilla war that's waged from 1919 and 1921, a truce, and then that's followed by a civil war. So I'm just going to talk primarily about maps and stories and narratives around that independence movement. So the independence movement, we wanted to look beyond the typical top-down narrative. And we also, you recognize that these are mass movements of working people, working class people, lower middle class folks. The elites had emerged are relatively unknown. And you're talking about 100,000 members of the IRA, you're talking about 25,000 members that coming them on, tens of thousands more involved in other kind of activity. So we wanted to kind of tell, that's kind of our focus. So we want to break this down. So this is a kind of an important photograph. That's Eamon de Valera there in the center. This is him standing for election, kind of Sinn Féin's first major political victory in Ennis in 1917, County Clare. He's on the courthouse steps addressing. And he's going to emerge as kind of the key political leader, going to tour the United States. Ends up being kind of shapes modern Ireland. It's the most important figure in that. And so, but we wanted to look at kind of breaking it down and just from this one photograph, just you can see so many different perspectives. So we can focus in on the police who are there right in the corner, very prominent, very clearly watching and sending a message that you're under observation and that they're here to secure you. And this is a period when open meetings are under a lot of scrutiny. And these are Irish police, Irish born and bred, Royal Irish Constabulary. They're going to kind of collapse under the pressure of this independence campaign, and they're going to be partially, they're going to be reinforced by British Army soldiers, but most famously, infamously, the Black and Tans, who are members of the RIC recruited from outside of Ireland. So we think about them. We also just kind of look at, we think about, who are the new folks emerging who are kind of taking this movement forward. And the remarkable thing about the revolutionary movement is they're all unknown, they're all essentially unknown, even locally in many cases, and they're coming from very modest backgrounds. And de Valera represents kind of an elite. He's teaches kind of part-time math, or he's a maths professor at a couple different schools. But he's mother's. There's debate about whether he was legitimate or illegitimate. His mother was a domestic servant in New York City. He was raised by his grandparents who were farm laborers in Brewery, County Limerick. Very modest backgrounds. And that's how we look at a lot of these folks. So you can kind of think, and then we also start to see, a little bit of clerical interest as well. But then when you also really study the revolutionary movement, the independence movement, what you realize is that the way they win, I argue, is they develop very sophisticated and effective propaganda. And much of their leadership comes from this cultural nationalism background. And they're involved in Gaelic League, which is the Irish language, but also like Irish dance, Irish theater. They're performative. They are literary. A lot of folks have newspaper backgrounds, and they're able to document and present a modern image of their movement that is amenable to a broad audience. And you also, one of the key successes with this movement is they mobilize the Irish diaspora and they sell a story about their struggle that it garners international sympathy. And at a certain point, that international sympathy embarrasses the British government enough that they make, kind of fundamental compromises. So we see journalists here. We can also see a woman who's involved here taking a photograph. She's probably taking that photograph right there. And so again, it kind of captures that. And then we also think just about the people who are either joining or staying aloof and kind of what their background is. And for me, I always think about the socioeconomic class in this period. You can also denote someone standing by their hat. Everyone wore hats. It's also Ireland, so everyone's got to wear a hat because it's raining all the time. And if you're kind of wealthy, middle class, you're wealthy, you might wear, the straw hat. A little bit, you might have a fedora or a Hamburg, like that. Those are kind of expensive. But real working people wear the soft cap, the flat cap, and that really denotes that you're working class. So you look at all the different hats here. I'd also say that. One of the periods here is the really huge, outrageous, big flat cap, and a lot of Irish young men. They had real dense, thick Irish hair, and they would grow out they would shave this kind of side, and they'd grow out their hair like that, so they could fill a big, huge flat cap. So you see some of those, like they're kind of outrageous. But you also see the number of women who are involved in there. So you can kind of see the women by their hats there, there. So you're kind of seeing what's the social makeup of this group. But then also, like, we think just about like, look at this kid. He's the only one who realizes that there's another photographer at work.
So just a question.
Yeah.
So women's suffrage hadn't been introduced at this point?
Women's suffrage was, it was 1918 was the first election with women's suffrage. This is 1917.
Right.
Coming on is more of a Republican movement, but they all believe in women's suffrage and they all believe in female participation in politics. And one of the features of the movement is very heavy female participation. And that's what a lot of international observers would have stated. But I used to think about this kid who's looking at the camera. And then we also kind of thought about, I was like, what's childhood? What's it like to grow up in this kind of period? What's it like to experience political violence or black and tans or, trauma of violence, but then also it's for a lot of kids, it's fun. Your school might get burned down or what have you, and it could be a real troubling time, but it can also just be a very much a riveting time for kids. So we're just kind of thinking about challenging kind of conventional narratives and introducing some stuff. So now kind of going into some of our maps here. So we also wanted to really emphasize socioeconomics and backgrounds and what are the economics of the time, what's the social backgrounds of folks involved and what have you. So this is a map we did using the 1901 census, which had been digitized, another great Irish government sponsored project. And these are tenements. And we wanted to document how much urban squalor there was. And not just in Dublin, but in Limerick, all the urban centers had real heavy, they had a lot of tenements, and tenements are basically where a whole family's living in one room. They don't have indoor plumbing, they're sharing toilets with their neighbors. And in a house, a 3-story house, you might have 6, 7 families of 9, 10 people. You might have 60, 70 people living in a single tenement. So we mapped that. And I also just wanted to mention I mentioned our cartographers. So we had kind of our main cartographers, this guy called Mike Murphy, just fires out maps. We had a second cartographer, guy who got trained by the Irish Army, Charlie Roach, and Charlie's like an artist. And Charlie would disappear for weeks and kind of then produce these beautiful imaginative maps. So this is Charlie's map. It denotes, he used the pension things to see how many adults, how many kids, rough the ages in each room. So this is accurate to the pension things for this. It's number 11 Henrietta Street. So that's accurate. Charlie's parents grew up in I think it's either parents or his grandparents were in a Dublin tenement. Just like that.
My father was born in Dublin tenement.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
In 33.
Yeah.
They moved out to Kimmage and Cummin in 36, 37.
Right. Exactly. So you have a certain understanding of this. So Charlie had a big family photograph. I think it's his grandparents from roughly this period, early 20th century. Big family photograph of his folks who lived in the tenement, and all these silhouettes are of his family. So he just kind of reused them. I just love that kind of idea. And so part of the thing is when you're dealing with all this kind of rich visual material, you can also add your own little kind of personal touches, which I think adds to its impact. So I also mentioned female participation. So we were able to map. Coming Amon was this mass movement of women. They were involved in they were kind of unarmed combatants, I would say, running messages, collecting information, storing weapons. They're also involved in a lot of the political work, collecting, canvassing. They were really important in elections. And I found this photograph in the the military archives, and it was a little file. It said unimportant personal papers from so and so of County Mayo, IRA guy, County Mayo. It's him and his girlfriend, and I love it because she's like. And again, you also see women kind of transitioning. So she's very much a modern figure. Instead of the long hair kind of up, she has the short kind of bob cut, which is much more practical. Another photograph, you see her dress is like up to the knees. she's holding her boyfriend's rifle, and then she's also got a smoke, you know, and so it's very, you know, it's very kind of rebel, you know, this map is we had individual Common branches that attended a national convention in Dublin in 1921 during a truce period. And what's fascinating about this is that we have a lot of female participation in Connacht. It's all really well documented, but they're not sending their branch. They're either their branches are unorganized or they don't have the resources to send a delegate to Dublin for this big convention. And that suggests a socioeconomic dimension to Common. What I also find about this is that when you actually study the women who are involved really closely, what you find is they're economically independent. They're not necessarily middle class or upper middle class, but they're women who work. And so they're working in factories, they're working as telegraph operators, they're working as in shop assistants, and because of that, they, under their own steam, are able to participate in dangerous revolutionary activity. So they have a degree of economic independence leads to this kind of political independence or political activism. But Connacht is a hell of a lot poorer, and I think that's reflecting that as well. So again, and I just want to emphasize what I learned from the geographers is that every map kind of tells a story. And a good map tells a different story. It tells a story. And for us as historians who are often archival, focused narrowly on things, the maps give you a chance to look at a broader picture, which is, again, I find really helpful for my own work. Just mentioning a couple other women who are heavily involved. Hannah G. Skeffington, who's a veteran suffrage campaigner. Her husband is murdered in 1916 by a kind of an army officer. And then and then she does a tour of the United States in 1917. And then we have Mary McSweeney, who is the sister of Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, who dies on hunger strike. And she's probably the best orator in the independence movement. She's absolutely lights out. And it's just basically, I got their itineraries and we just mapped it. And I like it because it's like showing you, you know, different forms of, I hadn't appreciated how important, like, when you look at Connecticut, you think of Massachusetts, you think of Pennsylvania. I'm from California, they're always going out there. But you think about, like, Connecticut's really important. Rhode Island gives more per capita to some of the funds than anywhere else in the United States. And again, kind of less obvious centers of our, you know, they're always going to Butte, Montana, because that's a real Irish town, and there's money there. They're always going to Kansas City. And Kansas, they're able to speak to the state legislature from that Kansas, even though it's Kansas City, Missouri, they're also in Kansas City, Kansas. So again, it's thinking about ways, different forms of engagement with the Irish-American diaspora, and kind of different ways of places that aren't quite as obvious. And again, this is a fund I got, and they had state results. And again, you see this is not by per capita head of population, but it's just blank things, and you see New York City is off the charts. But again, some of these other places you don't want to think of, Jersey, Illinois, etc. So I'm not going to get into British Army recruiting. I'm going to, well, I'll just give you this map real quick. We had collections of Irish volunteers when they were set up in 1914, and we had 1,000 enroll in the first kind of unit in Cork City. So we had addresses, and we mapped it out. And what's the story here is they're overrepresented in the working class areas, but not the real slums. So the areas with the tenements are underrepresented. Places like UCC aren't represented at all because the university students are comfortable middle class and they're not getting involved. So it's a different kind of movement. And then also the wealthy areas, Black Rock, Douglas, are underrepresented. So it's just kind of telling you, again, kind of a reflection. I won't get into this, but I'll just talk a little bit about disciplines and multidisciplinary approaches. So one of the great things about working in Ireland is it's small. And so you run into people, you run into academics a lot, and you can make a personal network relatively painless. I came across probably the premier cave archaeologist in Ireland, Marion Dowd, Dr. Marion Dowd. She teaches up at what was Sligo IT, now it's like Atlantic College. And we were talking about, she just produced this, she surveyed every cave in Ireland. And we were talking, and I was asking her about kind of caves used by the IRA during the Civil War and the independence movement. And she hadn't thought about it, and she went back and she went through her notes. And what her big thing is that everybody uses caves in times of emergency. And the other thing with caves is caves are really hard to find if you're not from like right where the cave is. Like you have to like you have to be from the area to know a cave. So it's great for fugitives, and like times of times of like bandits always use caves, political refugees always use caves, and what Marion found was how many of the caves are also used. And she also like denoted, and I was interested in this, like how coastal people also are using their waterways, using the kind of inlets and using the little coastal caves as well. So again, this is kind of, and we tried to bring in. We brought in folks from English, we brought in folks from geography also, but also we had some archaeologists and this idea of material culture and trying to explore and illuminate different activities through these different disciplines and their prisms. Just talking about a bit of a chronology, we have, so if you ever want to understand how the British Empire was able to rule 25% of the population, of the global population, and 25% of the territory, you look at their records. And the British had great records. And they had a really super effective bureaucracy, and particularly an internal security bureaucracy. So I mentioned this, the Royal Irish Constabulary. They had really detailed monthly reports of political meetings, economic activities, of industrial activities, trade unions. They followed people, and they also reported membership of what they would consider subversive organizations. And those aren't necessarily totally reliable, but but you see them growing over a period of time. They're telling their own story. So we were able to map this. I'll explain the other ones in a second. But what we're seeing pretty consistently is if you divide the island in half, and the west is, this is Ulster, this is Leinster, this is Munster, this is Connaught. Ulster isn't that heavy. Much of Ulster is not that heavily mobilized. That's now Northern Ireland. They have this big Ulster Unionist population. Makes sense. But what we found was Leinster is very underrepresented in terms of this kind of Republican militancy. And Munster is overrepresented, and a lot more violence happens in Munster. And Connaught is kind of a close second. And that's pretty persistent with all the maps that we were seeing. This is Cumann. What's also interesting about Cumann is a number of the police reports don't mention it as a dangerous organization, and they actually don't jail Cumann members because they don't regard them as dangerous, but they're very dangerous. But you see kind of a similar thing, and then this is IRA members, and again you're seeing something quite similar. So this kind of east-west divide, and conversely, this is the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which was quite Republican, quite militant, socialists, kind of flew a lot of red flags at certain stages, and they undertake a dramatic growth in the last 2 years of the First World War, and it continues on to 2021. And what we see here is, so you see they go from 30 branches in 1917 to 407 branches in 1920. And a lot of these are new branches, new organizations popping up. But what we see here is we see a lot more trade union activity here in Leinster, which makes sense. It's a more developed economy. But it's also saying that maybe some of this revolutionary discontent, maybe some of this public instability is manifesting itself in different ways in different parts of the country. And here it might be going into kind of radical trade union politics. And then this is another one. We were able to break down IRA membership, again, from this pension collection. We created big massive spreadsheets of every IRA unit in the country. These are the IRA was structured geographically, the local unit, and this is also true with kind of nationalist Ireland throughout the 19th and the 20th century. 20th century, it's a parish by parish organization, like how the GAA is organized today, the Gaelic Athletic Association. So you have local branches at the parish level or the neighborhood level. A bunch of them get together and create like a district branch. A bunch of them create like more like a county branch or almost county branch. And they also elect all their officers going all the way up. And this is how Sinn Féin runs, this is how IRA runs, this is how Cumann na mBan runs. So democratically governed collective leadership of the movement as well. And we had like 2,000 IRA companies at the lowest level, something like, I think it's 600 or 700 battalions, which are like districts, and then about 70 brigades, which are either at the county level or a little bit under. So anyway, just to nerd you out. But this also gives us just raw numbers. And again, you see this big east-west divide. And then also another aspect of our publication is we had 130 contributors to this volume. Our second volume we had about 90. So that's a big portion of everyone working in the field. And one of the folks who contributed a chapter was late Professor David Fitzpatrick at Trinity College Dublin, superb historian. And he broke this down. He used the same raw membership data by county, and then he broke it down by head of population, head of male population, and came up with this. So the darker, and again, our east-west is quite obvious. And what's also I find fascinating in terms of IRA membership per head of population is you see the Western Seaboard being very overrepresented. And again, I don't know what's going on there. It could be, and again, what a lot of this mapping does is it makes you ask questions. These are also the areas with the highest mortality rate during the famine. Maybe that's part of it. They're also socially, economically, culturally more further away from Britain. Fitzpatrick argued they're closer to the United States too, so maybe that's coming in. But that kind of coastal thing is quite obvious from this. This is also just kind of walking you through like how we create these maps. So it's based on archival research, and you're digging through. So this is one of my maps. The police tracked every armed attack on either them or the army for like a year and a half period. They're nice, easy records. They're telegrams, reports to Dublin Castle, so they're typed. So it's easy to come across. And you got a place, and you got a Temple Tui, wherever the hell that is. The important thing isn't who's getting killed or who's getting wounded. The important thing is these guys are being attacked, someone's trying to kill them. And so I was able to create a huge spreadsheet of like 1,200 of these episodes. And then I was able to map them. I mapped them per 6-month pans. And again, here's our big concentration down here. This is the first 6 months of the War of Independence, which not that much is going on. But then it really picks up kind of from the summer onwards. And again, you have this big concentration. Conics starting to come into the game as well. But then by the end of it, you're seeing just basically full contagion. And again, I think this is an important series of maps too, because one of the narratives is that the IRA was being defeated at the end of the Irish War of Independence. When actually, when you compile this data, there are twice as many attacks then as there were even 6 months previously. So it's actually getting more violent. And the violence is spreading to places that hadn't experienced it before. So again, that's kind of one of our maps. And I won't really talk about flying columns and all that business. I will just mention this is one of my specialties as well, is kind of the IRA campaign against suspected civilian informers. Again, that's a heavily contested topic in the literature. Lots of ugly debates going on, and it's basically about 200 civilians were executed by the IRA for suspected collaboration with the British forces. So it's there was an argument that Protestants were a lot more likely to be killed because of religious tensions, sectarian tensions. There was also an argument that people of low social status were being targeted. A lot of ex-soldiers, about half of them are ex-soldiers. So is there a kind of a pogrom against Irish ex-soldiers who served the British Army? I wouldn't agree with those interpretations. What we found, so this is a list of about 550 civilian suspects and they're listed by name. They got little mini dossiers for each of them. They're small little collections. And what we found is they're all over the place. They're all over the place, and there's no real there's Protestants are overrepresented, but they're not crazily overrepresented. And social class wise, everybody's involved. And particularly folks who are getting involved in trading, and there are also a lot of women involved. And this includes been a lot of gender violence. One of the big breakthroughs in the study of the period is recognition and illumination of gender-based violence, and including sexual assaults. And so you see this also kind of helps explain some of that as well. So again, using kind of news sources, mapping them, and then when you have that data, also doing more nuanced analysis. That's why I think all that is related. I won't get into this. And then again, we talk about, we've had this preponderance of interest in violence, political violence, which always in the Irish kind of nationalist tradition is often very much celebrated. But we also got to understand that this period saw one of its big successes was it had a very active, very vibrant civil disobedience element that allowed easy access to folks who weren't going out shooting people, and that is a big part of this story, and kind of the capture of local government by the Republicans, by the independence movement. It's a big part of this, and so this is the Dole National Loan, which was raised to fund the revolutionary civil administration. And it was very successful. This is kind of how Michael Collins made his reputation. And again, we still see the East-West divide, not quite as pronounced. And we have kind of different hotspots. So again, kind of using different sources to underscore different elements of all this. And then we mentioned black and tans. We use compensation data that's only recently becoming available, and we were able to map different forms of reprisals, of collective punishment used against the Irish population, Irish civilian population. So we have the crops destroyed, public buildings destroyed, mainly by arson. Towns, they were called them sacking of towns, where black and tans are these non-Irish special police. They'd ride into a town after an IRA ambush on police forces, and they'd shoot it up, and kind of burn down some businesses, maybe shoot one or two local Republicans. So just kind of mapping the geography of that. And then you also realize that there are areas where the Crown Force behavior is much worse than it is elsewhere. It's an uneven story, some of it reflecting less political violence, but some of it also reflecting better discipline among the Crown Forces. So again, just telling different stories. So that's kind of that's kind of the content. I'll just kind of close out in less than 10 minutes or so, talking about the public dimension of all this, public history dimension. So we produced this. This came out in the autumn of 2017. The book is like physically huge. It's 1,000 pages, weighs 11 pounds. Like they had to create special book bags for it. We were looking at getting like a little design in the back to like a little prop up. It's actually kind of hard to read. And we had contributors, as I said, all the academics in the field. We also had a lot of scholars who weren't full-time academics. So we had librarians, we had archivists, we had people who were doing really good work on their own. We brought them in as well. So we had kind of this collective, kind of like my Golden State Warriors. You're stronger together. The introduction was written by the President of Ireland. We were lucky. Michael D. Higgins he's an academic. He's a sociologist. He wrote a really, really nuanced, very sophisticated analysis of all this. So that was great. Every school in the country got a copy. The Department of Education purchased copies for all the primary and secondary schools. It was kind of affordable. The book cost, I think, 60 euros. So a hell of a lot cheaper than like a Routledge monograph or any of that. And it was like an unprecedented success. We had about 40,000 copies sold in that first year and a half. And we would regard we wouldn't regard this as a popular history book. We'd regard this as a scholastic book. But the text was written in a way we kind of wrote our text in a way to be more accessible. We kind of massaged it down a little bit. There were footnotes so it wasn't just kind of off the bat. And yeah, it was the best-selling scholastic Irish history book ever. And then we won a bunch of prizes and got really good reviews and all. That was great. And there's old Michael D. with us. We also, off the basis of that, the national broadcaster RTE decided to fund a big, very professional, 3-part documentary series based on the book, and kind of uniquely to us, UCC put money into this. Not a lot of money, but they put enough money that UCC. We had one of the associate producers was a UCC academic, was our head of our special artistic officers, and she was dealing with us. So we had a voice in all this. So the documentary was based on extensive scholarly research, and then the scholars had a voice in the production. We didn't have the dominant voice, but we had a voice. So that was great. We also got our boy Killian Murphy, who's one of Cork's most famous exports. Killian Murphy's parents are school teachers, and his dad, I don't know what his mom teaches. His dad is a history and geography teacher. So his dad loved the book, so he did it to us for kind of cost. And so that was great. And so having him attached was fantastic. We had to record it around Peaky Blinders because he was in about his 3rd season of that. Now that in turn launched us into a second documentary, also based on the book, because our first documentary was so successful, and that was called The Irish Civil War. We got that narrated by Brendan Gleeson. You don't need a photo of, not nearly as handsome. Yeah. Brendan Gleeson's a retired was a school teacher, and I know he taught Irish. I think he taught history as well. So he was more than willing to step forward. The third documentary was the Atlas of Great Famine documentary, and that was narrated by Liam Neeson. And again, we got really big names pretty much at cost. So that was a big part of it. But also the way these were structured, we also got UCC put in some money. And again, because of that, we had an academic say into it. And for the documentary producers, they didn't have to do their own research. We were just kind of spoon feeding them things, asking what they kind of wanted for. They created the narrative, and we were able to kind of backfill it and also provide, I think, a level of nuance. I think these are really good productions. And then we had RTE on board with us. So we did a screening of an episode at Cork Opera House. It sold out in 3 hours. It's 1,000 seats. The RTE Orchestra live scored the episode. They commissioned music for it. They commissioned an original score, original songs. So we were able to do that. So some different kind of cultural strands coming together. And then that in turn got us. We were able to secure funding for this big Irish Civil War National Conference, 4-day event. We had a couple thousand people show up. We had all kinds of public. We had walking tours. We had a big public component to it. special exhibits. I'm trying to think what were some of the things we had. We had like head schools in town. We had like there was an art exhibit, all kinds of different public involvement. We had a couple thousand people come up to UCC for this. No one charged it. That was great. We brought together about 130 scholars, and off the back of that, we did a second book, which is the Atlas of the Irish Famine, which was more original content, and we produced more original maps, and that also did well. So I guess I just want to kind of close by saying with this idea of kind of the public dimension, there was intense public interest in this from across all segments of Irish society. Ireland, if you go over there, you know people are very geographically focused. They're from their parish. This really fed right into it. We had a conscious effort of the idea of showing the local and linking the local, and a lot of these local stories were known, but then linking the local to the regional, to the national, and to the international. So to provide a context to these very narrow kind of parochial narratives. And what we also found is we dealt with really problematic aspects of contemporary Irish, partition, sectarianism, violence, sexual violence against women, state violence, some of the most heavily politicized individual events in 20th century Irish history. And what we found was there was a public appetite to engage with that, and we had built up, and the scholars and the collective group was able to produce this kind of contested history in a way that people realized that we didn't really have we didn't have a obvious political agenda, that we were just scholars doing our job and we were trying to allow folks to engage with it. And what I'd finally say is that the original book, we had 300 maps, 300 photos and documents. Most hadn't been seen before. That introduced a whole new audience to us. It allowed an easy on-ramp to these individual components of this history. And I think that kind of, the idea of not just thinking beyond the very narrow scholastic audience or even the little bit of the broader audience, but also thinking more imaginatively about how you can make this history seem relevant to contemporary society without breaking the integrity of your historical scholarship. I think I'll leave it there. So, thank you. He's a little guy, Michael D.
We have time for questions if people have questions.
So when you were talking about the IRA attacks on Crown Forces,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned that like some of the people, like civilians that were killed by the IRA were Protestant. And I don't know a lot of Irish history, but were there a lot of Irish Protestants?
Yeah. So in terms of that religious dimension, keep in mind that if you one way of kind of looking at things, this revolutionary period is like it's kind of like 4 overlapping wars. You got like the Easter Rising, which is mainly a Dublin event. You got the War of Independence, which goes on across the island, but you got revolutionary forces against Crown forces, and some of their Irish supporters. You also have a sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland, where it's very much intercommunal around the setting up of what's now Northern Ireland. And then you have a second war over the peace negotiations, a peace treaty, the Irish Civil War, which is between basically Irish Catholic nationalists. So each of those has its own element. In terms of there has been debate among historians. It's been a really intensive debate about whether the IRA campaign against Protestant informers was influenced by sectarianism, or was primarily sectarian. I would be, kind of my first book was argued that it wasn't, that actually you have to contextualize it, and actually when you look at the numbers, they're in different parts of the country, the numbers are quite small in terms of number of Protestants attacked. There was, however, anxiety for sure there was anxiety among the Protestant population. And there's also, I didn't show this map because it's complicated and I won't get into it. I also wrote an article about this really horrific event, the worst event by far in the South, which is what we call the Bandon Valley Massacre, which was in 1922, and it was a series of IRA attacks on Protestant civilians in this area around Bandon. But me and my co-author Andy Bielenberg, we contextualized it. We also found a lot more attacks than had been acknowledged privately. This is an extremely contested. We issued a boring academic. We wrote a boring academic article, and when we produced it, we had a little seminar, and it was in the Irish Times, in the newspaper, and we had, that doesn't happen for heady stuff for academics. So the religious, how sectarian was the war, that's still being debated, and this is also still very much a live political issue in the South. There were efforts among some folks down in West Cork to get a state apology for this event. But there was also resistance to that as well. And then there's also the Irish Protestants aren't a monolith. And Ida Milne has written about how a lot of Protestants don't really want this victim narrative to take hold. So that's still kind of heavily contested. And then up north, you still have, this is still highly problematic in contemporary Northern Ireland as well. So it's all complicated.
There was another slight wrinkle with that, in that the Protestant population was probably slightly more impacted by losses from World War I, because their sons were much more likely to have gone and volunteered, whereas the Catholic Irish population were less likely. Outside of the
what I would say is that the Protestant population kind of falls off a demographic cliff. But again, my co-author Andy Bielenberg, he's done really good work on this. He wrote a really good article in Past and Present about Protestant emigration, and what he found was there's voluntary immigration, there's First World War stuff, there's the British garrison leaves in 22. There's a lot of folks from the South, a lot of Protestants in the South moved to Northern Ireland. A lot of them emigrate entirely. And a lot of emigration is well after this revolution. It's like 1925, 26, 27.
That also started in the 1890s.
Yes, and that's exactly, yes, I was going to get to that. Is that it had started earlier, but Andy also argues that this was clearly had an impact. But it's very difficult to quantify. And it's very difficult to quantify who are conflict refugees and who isn't. So, yes.
Well, first, thanks for sharing your knowledge and research with us.
Thank you.
On a Winter's Day. Some of us, we think of revolutionary Ireland during these years, think of Dublin as the center of that movement. But what you are saying in your research and your mapping analysis suggesting that it was not the center, it was for ordinary people, the foot soldiers of the movements, was the Southwest and the West. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, did I get that correct?
Yeah.
And why that is the case, and you focus a lot on the social and economic backgrounds of these ordinary people. Is there a correlation between a social portrait and revolutionary activity in the various regions?
So I would say there might be a Goldilocks kind of thing going on, and Munster is kind of just right. Connacht, what I think is Connacht's a bit too poor there's absolutely the ideologies there. Connacht is very important in the Civil War. That's the anti-treaty stronghold, is Connacht, and people who want change, who want fundamental change. But it's also really poor. So you have I think they don't quite have the resources to maintain kind of the armed resistance you see in the South. The other thing I'd say about about kind of Munster is they had had a really strong movement there prior to the 1916 rising, and then they hadn't risen up in 1916. So the whole movement remained intact. You had the places outside of Dublin that rise up in 1916 are Galway, kind of East Galway, Meath, and Wexford. And those organizations get smashed up. They get hundreds of arrests. The networks kind of get undone. Galway never recovers. Meath never recovers. Wexford comes back, and Wexford's are kind of the last guys still fighting in the Civil War on the anti-treaty side. So, what I think is that's also a big disruption. And a lot of this energy goes into, in Munster, goes into armed resistance. And maybe there's also I always argue, if for anybody from Ireland, that there's a kind of the idea that, and I'm also in Cork, so the idea is, some Irish historians claim that Cork was really jealous of Dublin. And I would call it like the Roy Keane theory, that Roy Keane is kind of this completely insane Corkman and this manifesting. I don't think it's like that. But what I would say about Dublin is also, or in terms of demographics, Dublin has a big Protestant population, big Unionist population. It had a huge ex-soldier population, and it had real deep poverty. So this is recruiting in the British Army by regimental enlistment areas. Nationally, and what you can see is like Dublin has a huge ex-soldier population. So politically, they might not be as easily to radicalize because of that. And then also the other thing about the 1916 rising is the movement's decapitated in Dublin, so they have to rebuild, and that I think is also kind of a factor. But the other thing I want to emphasize too is much of my work is on kind of armed resistance and stuff. You get a lot of unarmed, you get a lot of civil disobedience, and then you also get a lot of socioeconomic agitation. In terms of, there's a lot of radical trade union politics going on. It really emerges during the truce and early parts of the Civil War, and not all that's in Munster. A lot of that is national. So I think you get different manifestations of unrest in different parts of the country by location, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you so much, John. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I have to sort of thank you twice because, so much of my own fiction is, the scaffolding was based on a lot of theories. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's great to hear.
But I just want to ask, were you surprised during the decade of centuries, the cordiality between all the, historically differing factions, like even amongst families, people were actually willing and able to listen to each other and listen to each other's narratives and stories. Did that surprise you?
I think, I've always done a lot of, so one of the things about Ireland is everyone's history obsessed. We have, where I'm down in Cork, we have so many local historical societies. We have probably at least a dozen historical societies with their own journals, and anybody involved in the History Society knows how challenging that is. So when you go out and talk to folks, you realize how deep the interest is, and also that they're not necessarily. You occasionally get somebody who's got a very strong political opinion about things, but for the most part, they just want to be better informed. And I think that was the idea. I think that's what became apparent. For the government initially, kind of saw this as a way of bringing in a bunch of international, kind of like the gathering, which we'd had, that it was going to be a big media event and a big tourism event. And then folks at RTE, and one of the things that I'd emphasize too is RTE as a national broadcaster, I think it was really key to kind of some of our success, because we got good support from RTE. And you go back to 2015 when this was still at its opening stages. It was called the History Show. It's a weekly radio show by Miles Dungan, who's a broadcaster who's also got a PhD in history from UCD. And they put together a thing called Road to the Rising, and it was a series of public lectures on one day in downtown and city center Dublin. And I spoke at like 2 different events. They had over 100,000 people show up. Like everyone. I spoke at an event in Liberty Hall. And they have a theater. It was like 500 people. I spoke at the Metropole. It was like 400 people, and every single event they had was packed to capacity. And that's what we. And like in 2016, I spoke at something like 46 events. You know, so there was events everywhere, and all of them were well attended. And so I think that gave people the willing. I think people just wanted to engage with it, and that kind of subordinated those kind of internal politics. And we even saw that with the Civil War. That was the one everyone was afraid of. And I think that for whatever reason, I think that cumulative, widespread public engagement created a kind of a safe space for, and also the government also really relied on the academics quite a bit because we were regarded as more neutral, and I think that was a big part of it.
The 100 years now.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. You have all these things, and it was an organizing thing. And as I said, there was also, there was a special unit. So the department, excuse me, let me finish. There was the Department of Arts, Culture, and the Gaeltacht, and then maybe the media, whatever. They changed that department a couple times. They had their own special unit of civil servants who they could pick up the phone and call the Taoiseach. So there was real political power behind all this. I think that was part of it. And they basically were like, okay, the politicians don't want to get egg because there were a couple heavy-handed political attempts to do events. Most famously, there was an effort by the Minister of Justice to do a special commemoration for all the members of the Royal Irish Constabulary who were killed in the War of Independence. But that included these black and tans. And that was like a detonation. And because of that, they were even like, okay, we'll just let the scholars and also the local committees do it. And I think all that kind of created a lot of
it's astonishing how families, just individual families who had never spoken about the rift between families were finally able to kind of cough it all up,
And also to understand their own stories or their own family. I've heard that from a lot of people particularly about the Civil War, is all of a sudden you start to understand their own internal their own family narratives. Like, oh yeah, that makes more sense now. Well, you were saying, sorry.
That the 100 years separation, it was 100 years ago, so people weren't directly, they didn't actually know these people that had been killed. They were their grandfathers or their great-grandfathers or their own great-uncles. There was that generational gap that separated people from the actual raw earth.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was a big part of it. I'll mention really briefly because I was involved in this Bandon Valley thing. It's like the third rail, right? So my friend Andy Bielenberg, who's a colleague of myself and Hiram Morgan there at UCC, Andy was researching it. We were, I think it was before our article came out, but we were circling around it, and a public lecture was organized in Cork City. Hiram, did you chair that?
Unfortunately.
Yeah. And they had it.
I thought I was trying to quail a rat at one point.
but it was 300 people in that room, and then they had a spillover room with maybe another 100. I mean, on like a Sunday. And so, wow, all these people went. So we publish our article. Maybe a year later, I go down to Demandway, with kind of the center of all this, to give my talk. And I'm like, okay, I'm going into the belly of the beast. Like, whew. And there are only like 30 people there. I'm like, huh? Like, geez, there were 300, like 400, like last year. What's going on? And somebody told us, he's like, well, thing is, no one wants their neighbor, because it's like people are living alongside each other. So what you also realize is that a lot of people talked about this stuff, but they didn't really necessarily want all the poison passed on to the next generation. So they often kind of held back a little bit. But a lot of the families held these narratives quietly and privately. But they wouldn't tell, Catholics wouldn't, like the narrative here was that the Catholics thought the Protestants who were hit were informers. The Protestants thought they were hit because the Catholics wanted their land. And neither was really correct there. They're trying to interpret stuff. So the Protestants didn't want to bring this up again because they knew that it really, like, it portrayed their Catholic neighbors as patriotic forebearers, as villains, land-grubbing murderers of civilians. And this is an ugly episode, a bunch of midnight calls and what have you, with people getting dragged out of their beds and shot. Catholics also didn't want to necessarily call the victims like, oh, you guys had it coming. So there was people didn't like to talk about this publicly because they didn't want to antagonize their neighbors, and they knew it would create communal unease. So they were silent about it. And that kind of silence should also be respected. And people are like, it's like, no, actually, we're cool. Like, we don't need to rehash this. We all, whatever. And what it was explained to me was that folks didn't want to come to Demandway to hear me talk because they didn't want to antagonize their neighbors by bringing this up. But when it was up in the city, people go, oh, geez, I was up shopping and I happened to see the Demandway, so we snuck in and saw it, and that's how it was. It was basically really curious about it, but not so curious that you wanted to alienate or antagonize your neighbors. And we saw something similar with the Civil War stuff, and that's again quite heavily contested. And people are curious about it, but they don't necessarily want to get in a big fight with they know they're going to disagree with their neighbors about it, and they don't really want that.
Maybe
So,
after 150 years.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. I feel silly that I didn't bring a copy of the Atlas,
Oh.
which we have, but
We could drop it out the window and kill somebody.
but thank you, Hiram, for being here, for coming through Villanova. I wanted to ask just a question about archive.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the military service pension is open in the IRA nominal rolls.
Yeah.
How many people perhaps are not included in that? I know that's impossible, but what would be your estimate?
The nominal rolls, I think, they're really accurate.
Right.
Or let's put it this way. They included all the correspondence. So the way they got these nominal rolls was they got the senior officers together of all the different units, and they would come up with lists. Some of the lists also, they had originals. So I've come across a couple battalion rolls that were contemporary of 1921. God help them, I don't know why they were keeping membership lists, but they're very bureaucratic, and they match up. But sometimes they would have several lists, and there would be internal debate about what was accurate. Oh no, that's something. And they're going through it name by name. So and so, what wasn't involved? Yeah, they were, or they have the big things. They have disagreements about who were officers and stuff. But it's a good faith effort. And the big thing with the pensions is that you had to have super active service to get a pension. So they only gave 8,000, and like 80,000 people applied, and then also thousands of people never recognized the state and never applied.
Or emigrated.
Or emigrated. And the emigration is fascinating. I didn't mention it. I was saying this earlier. From San Francisco. My mom's from Oregon. My mom's family would be Oregon Irish, like cowboy Irish, like sheep herders out in Central Oregon. And there's like a Donegal kind of pocket in Oregon, because Oregon's not Catholic at all. It's not Irish at all. But there's another pocket in the southern Oregon desert in Newmarket, North Cork, where Sean Moylan's from, Kishkane, for our Moylan people. And there they list the nominal rolls, and they list emigrate, so it's good immigration records. USA, it's all USA. But then there it's Oregon, so they denote whether someone's emigrated to New York or to USA, but they give a special immigration denoting that they weren't to Oregon, because everyone goes to Oregon. And so it's that kind of demographic stuff that you see in those. It's just absolutely fascinating.
Your idea of a possible atlas of the Irish diaspora.
Yeah.
I'm from Rhode Island. I was fascinated, and my relations are West Cork. There's just so much in the atlas that you could dig into.
Yeah, and also when you think of things, and this is also like these, the what do you call it? The money, the dole loan. Or actually, I'll go back to the American one. Those are, per capita, per head of population.
Yeah.
It's Rhode Island and Connecticut.
I know where those places are.
Exactly. I'm from and what you also realize it's the mill towns. the factory, and it's the factory workers.
Right.
It's not Mayor Curley, Boston, and again in Montana, it's these.
Well, there
It's
were
these.
fundraising efforts.
Yeah.
There were clubs.
Yeah.
You know, and everybody, you go to the club, there were parishes.
Yeah, parish and that kind of stuff. And this is what I always say too. Well, I'll say two things because I'm here to advertise. Our MAs in Irish history. If anybody wants to come over, we'd love to have you. And I have literature. But I always think that Irish studies in the States, that really the diaspora is so rich. It's well documented. The Irish diaspora, they're here at a critical time. They're, as particularly the Catholics are outsiders, and it's also really relevant today. Immigrant populations, how they're treated, how they're dealing with this. I'd argue that all this among Irish historians, they're like, oh, like the Irish America, it's all great. Well, this is taking place during the Red Scare, when there's mass, like again, Oregon passes a law banning Catholic schools in 1924, and the biggest Ku Klux Klan populations are Indiana, Oregon, Idaho, Washington State, and they're not Oregon. They're not many African Americans there. It's anti-Catholic.
Yeah, well, and this is the founding of Villanova.
Exactly.
As well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You guys are. Yeah, that's your foundation story, and that's what we should be. That's what we should be thinking about, and particularly times of xenophobia. It's important. This is all quite relevant, and yeah.
There's also some. And then we can wrap up because I don't want to keep you on the hot seat forever. But I find it remarkable that the Irish government, not remarkable, but I find it admirable that the Irish government supported this effort to the extent that it has, and it continues to. The funding in the United States for these kinds of projects at the national level is ridiculous, and has been decimated. But even before that, per capita, Irish investment in publishing, TV, culture is 4 times what it is in the United States. 4 times what it has been. And this is before the current administration.
Yeah.
So it's remarkable, and it shows the benefit of a government that trusts its academics, that works with its academics. And so I just to say that out there.
Hiram, do you have anything? I would say it's not always that way, but and there's also a real ready market for a lot of this. The goodwill is there among the public, so it's kind of an open goal.
It hasn't always been there.
And it hasn't always been there.
Absolutely.
And then I'd also and having a national broadcaster who, and particularly in the last years, they've been under a lot of pressure. Yeah. So they're trying to advertise their this role as a cultural kind of foundation stone, and I think we benefited from that too. So yeah, it's all.
They're so trusted.
Yeah.
As a national broadcaster.
Yeah.
I mean, there's very few countries in the world where you can trust your national broadcaster. And they're not just the government's mouth.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's just wonderful.
It's funny when you meet these RT. There are a couple of them. A lot of people in the broadcaster are historians, and or have an interest in history.
Their archives are amazing.
And their archives, they just did, and that was another one of these things, making their archives available.
But
Yeah.
I think it was an opportune time for the government to invest in this, like after the Troubles, like as you said, like that was a key. And also, like as regards to public participation, that was great, and that was partly because we had a sort of dry run at this with the publication, the digitized censuses, which plugged everybody locally into the family story. And then when all this stuff unfurled during the revolutionary period, like the Bureau of Military History stuff, the pensions, and people started to look up their stuff, and everybody was participating in a way that they could sort of, and as a result, whatever stories they had from their past actually became much more nuanced and contextualized, and actually a lot of the old hoary myths went out the window quite quickly, I think.
I mean, going to your point about the more people served in the British Army than served in the IRA and a hell of a lot more people died. But then it's a democratic. What we saw was a democratization of of Irish history, where it's broken down not by elite studies of elites, but through that kind of local level. And I think that ended up being really helpful. And this and again, I don't know if it wasn't like it was pre-planned, but this approach really answered that need. And I think and then that gave us this momentum. So
I think that there'll actually be quite an interesting ending to this with the 1926 census, which comes out in April, because that will show how the new state was demographically constituted in a different way because of immigrations and so on and so forth.
yeah.
And so that will be interesting, and that will perhaps a capstone in this whole.
I was always someone explained it to me that the success of the digitization of the pensions is Irish people are always really dangerously curious about their neighbors. So it wasn't necessarily even looking up your own family; it's looking up your neighbors and seeing what they were up to.
There's such a massive investment. There's an ethos of investing in history. Because, for example, the last census that we had.
Right.
Every single family got to fill out, every single person got to fill out their own little story at the bottom. For somebody to read 100 years from now.
Yeah, it's great.
Like to say what we're doing on that particular day.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Give you a big round of
Yeah,
applause.
thank you. My pleasure.